I gave up everything for my daughter: love, career, friends, even my own name. For 30 years, I lived only for her, stitching her dresses by hand, skipping meals so she wouldn't have to, and clapping in every school auditorium like the proudest mother alive. But on her wedding day, in front of hundreds of smiling guests, she turned to another woman and said, "Thank you, Mom." Then she looked at me and added, "Miss Margaret, could you help with the cake?" That was the moment my heart didn't just break. It disappeared. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just walked away. That night, I erased myself from the life I built. No more photos, no more messages, no forwarding address. But don't mistake my silence for weakness. This is not the story of a woman abandoned. This is the story of how a forgotten mother became unforgettable, without anyone noticing until it was too late. Margaret lived in a quiet one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Columbus, Ohio, surrounded by fading wallpaper and a lifetime of silences. At 63, her days were predictable. Tea at dawn, tending to her indoor plants, and browsing the local library's online catalog, even though she'd retired from there 8 years ago. She rarely got visitors, and the phone rang less and less. But that didn't bother her. She had trained herself to find comfort in solitude, a skill honed through decades of necessity, not choice. 3 decades ago, Margaret had been the best reference librarian in her district. Sharp, efficient, the kind of woman who remembered not just your name, but the book you borrowed 3 years ago. Her world was made of card catalogs and the scent of old pages. That is, until Claire happened. Claire wasn't planned. She was the result of a short-lived romance that ended faster than it began. The man disappeared without ever knowing he'd fathered a child. Margaret, then 30, stood alone with a pink test strip and a storm of fear inside her. When she told her parents, they didn't speak, just stared, their faces stiff with shame. The next morning, they left a note on the kitchen table. "You made your choice, so will we." Margaret packed everything she owned into her hatchback and drove 4 hours away, not knowing where she'd land. She found a cheap basement apartment and got hired as a part-time assistant at a public library. Her belly grew as winter settled over Ohio. Each day, she shelved books with one hand and clutched her back with the other. She smiled through nausea, counted coins to afford prenatal vitamins, and sang lullabies to her unborn child in the quiet of cold nights. Claire arrived one December night, just as a blizzard swept through the city. Margaret had felt the first contraction while shelving returns. She called a cab, praying it would make it in time. It did, barely. Claire was born in the backseat of a taxi, wrapped in the flannel coat Margaret had been wearing. No doctors, no family, just Margaret, panting through the pain, whispering, "You're here now, my little miracle." From that moment on, Margaret became someone else. She worked 3 jobs, mornings at the library, afternoons cleaning office buildings, and evenings proofreading for a local magazine. She fed Claire mashed carrots and skipped her own dinner. When Claire needed braces, Margaret canceled her own root canal. She stitched school uniforms by hand, turned thrift store finds into prom dresses, and taught Claire how to balance equations before she knew how to ride a bike. Dating? Never crossed her mind. Weekends were for laundry, library visits, and reading books together on the couch. She turned down 2 proposals, one from a kind bus driver and one from a divorced dentist, because she feared they'd complicate Claire's stability. Margaret's dreams became silent passengers. She buried her wanderlust beneath piles of children's books and bills, but she never resented it. Not once. Every hug from Claire was a sunrise. Every "I love you, Mom" stitched another piece of armor around Margaret's tired heart. Her sacrifices became invisible scaffolding beneath her daughter's success. The first time Margaret saw Claire in a white lab coat during her medical residency, she cried in the hospital hallway. Claire had grown into a brilliant, disciplined woman, calm under pressure, quick-witted, always composed. Patients adored her. Doctors respected her. Margaret stood in the shadows, proud and unnoticed, just as she'd always been. Then came the moment she kept folded like a treasure in her wallet. Claire's high school graduation. Each student had to submit a short essay titled My Hero. Claire's essay was read aloud by the principal. My hero doesn't wear a cape. She doesn't fly or lift buildings. She works 3 jobs. She eats 1 meal a day so I can have 2. She smiles when she's tired, sings when I cry, and never complains. Not even once. My hero is my mom, Margaret. She's the reason I'm here, the reason I believe in good people, and the reason I know what love really means. The auditorium clapped, but Margaret couldn't hear it. Her ears were full of tears, her heart thundering. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Not as a provider, not as a utility, but as a person, a mother. That essay became her anchor. In the years that followed, whenever bills piled high or loneliness crept in like fog, she would unfold the copy she kept in her bedside drawer and read it again. My hero is my mom. She memorized the words, let them warm her like a fireplace in winter. She believed deep in her bones that her love had mattered, that Claire would always remember, that maybe, just maybe, all those quiet sacrifices had built a bond too deep to be broken. There had been a moment, an offer, that could have rewritten everything. When Claire was 6 months old, Margaret's life was unraveling faster than she could sew it back together. The utilities were weeks overdue. Her car had died permanently in the snow, and she'd just been laid off from the office cleaning job. She'd been skipping meals for days, surviving on tea and saltine crackers. Then came the visit. Mrs. Halbrook was the director of the library's funding board. An elegant woman with cashmere scarves and pearls that never clinked, she approached Margaret after a particularly grueling shift, offering a ride home. Margaret hesitated, but accepted. The conversation that followed felt like a dream. My husband and I can offer Claire everything, Mrs. Halbrook said gently, eyes scanning the small, cramped apartment. Education, travel, private health care. She could even go to Europe one day. We can legally adopt her. You'll still be part of her life, of course, but from a distance. Just think about the future she could have. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched Claire close, feeling the baby's slow breath against her chest. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the snow fall, replaying Mrs. Halbrook's words over and over. By sunrise, she had made her decision. Margaret returned the next day and said simply, Claire stays with me. No explanations, no debates. She just walked away with her daughter in her arms, unsure of how they'd survive, but certain she couldn't trade her child for comfort, no matter how noble it sounded. That decision defined everything. Years later, when Claire received a full scholarship for undergraduate studies, Margaret thought the hardest part was over. But med school was different. Loans weren't enough, and the hidden costs, textbooks, housing, endless fees, piled up like a cruel joke. Margaret picked up night shifts shelving warehouse stock. Her knees began to ache. Her vision blurred under flickering fluorescence. When the financial aid fell short in Claire's second year, Margaret knew what had to be done. Inside an old jewelry box she hadn't opened in decades lay the only inheritance she had. Her mother's wedding ring, white gold with a tiny sapphire. It was the only thing she hadn't pawned during the early years of desperation. She wrapped it in a cloth napkin, held it for a long time, then walked into a jewelry shop and placed it on the counter. I just need enough to get through the next semester, she whispered. The clerk didn't ask questions. The transaction was quick, sterile. The ring disappeared into a velvet pouch, and with it, so did the last tangible piece of her mother. When she handed Claire the tuition check, she lied. It's a loan program for retired state employees, she said, smiling. Claire kissed her cheek and said, You're a magician, Mom. Margaret smiled too, but it felt like glass, cracking beneath her skin. Then came the engagement. Jason was from a prominent family. His mother was all pearls and posture, eerily reminiscent of Mrs. Halbrook. Margaret smiled politely through every dinner, complimented every flower arrangement, and agreed to every suggestion. When Claire told her the wedding theme would be classic minimalism, Margaret didn't ask what that meant. She just got to work. She offered to make Claire's wedding dress, not to save money, but because she wanted her hands in every thread. She chose silk over lace, hand-stitched embroidered vines along the hem, and sewed a small pocket inside the bodice with a note. For your strength, for your softness, and everything between. Love, Mom. She never told Claire about the note. Each night she worked by the kitchen lamp, poking her fingers raw, measuring twice, cutting once. The dress began to take shape slowly, elegant, modest, ethereal. Claire visited a few times, offering feedback like a client reviewing a design. Can we raise the neckline a bit? The waist feels loose. And Margaret nodded, adjusted, never flinched. Inside, she told herself, this is love in motion. She imagined the moment, Claire walking down the aisle, eyes brimming, pausing to say, my mom made this. She pictured guests turning to Margaret, smiling, maybe even clapping. Just once, she wanted to be seen not as the woman in the corner with quiet hands, but as the one who built the whole damn foundation. The night before the final fitting, Margaret tried the dress on herself. She stood in front of the mirror, the silk cool against her skin, her fingers brushing the embroidered vines as if reading Braille. The dress didn't fit her, not really. But that wasn't the point. She wanted to feel the weight of it, to let herself pretend just for a moment. In the mirror, she didn't see a tired old woman. She saw a mother, a maker, a woman who had given her youth, her body, her dreams, and still stood. Her reflection shimmered, almost foreign. She held the moment like a breath, then blinked, and it was gone. She carefully removed the dress, folded it over her arm, and placed it in a protective garment bag. Before turning out the light, she looked at herself one last time. Her expression was soft but clouded, like someone hoping to be remembered, but preparing to be forgotten. The weeks leading up to the wedding blurred into a carousel of logistics and quiet erasures. Margaret found herself in charge of nearly everything, arranging bouquets, coordinating the cake vendor, addressing envelopes in her neat cursive. Claire and Jason oversaw the process like distant supervisors, offering occasional input but rarely gratitude. It's coming together, Claire would say, scrolling through mood boards on her phone. Jason mostly nodded, occasionally tossing in a half-formed opinion like, "Can we make the centerpieces more neutral?" Margaret didn't mind the workload. It gave her something to do, a structure to wrap around the awkward silences and growing distance between her and her daughter. She poured herself into the details, hand-tying the ivory ribbons for each bouquet, baking a trial batch of lavender lemon cupcakes, even practicing calligraphy for the seating chart. She wanted everything to be perfect, not for herself, but for Claire. Always Claire. One evening, while dropping off invitation envelopes at Claire's apartment, Margaret noticed something odd on the return address labels. Claire's name was listed as Dr. Claire Whitmore. She blinked. Whitmore was Jason's surname. Later that night, she worked up the courage to ask, "I didn't know you'd already changed your name," she said casually while folding linen napkins for the rehearsal dinner. Claire barely looked up. "Oh yeah, I filed it early. Makes credentialing easier at the hospital. And you know how Jason's family is about legacy stuff." Margaret's hands paused mid-fold. "But you haven't even had the ceremony yet." Claire shrugged. "It's just paperwork, Mom. No big deal." Margaret nodded slowly, a tightness crawling up her chest. She didn't argue, didn't protest, but something inside her twisted, like a thread pulled too taut. She smiled instead, picked up the next napkin, and kept folding. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and cold. Sunlight filtered through high windows as guests arrived in tailored suits and silk dresses, buzzing with polite conversation and champagne. Margaret arrived early to set up the welcome table and final touches. She wore a deep green dress, not white, not flashy, but soft and dignified. Her hair was pinned back neatly, and she wore a brooch that once belonged to her grandmother. As she finished placing programs at each seat, the wedding planner, a young woman named Dana, approached. "Excuse me," Dana said with a clipboard in hand. "Could you help light the candles at the back row? We're short on staff." Margaret blinked. "Oh, sure." No one introduced her. No one said, "This is the bride's mother." She wasn't listed in the printed program. There was no mention of her role, her presence. her sacrifices. She lit the candles silently, then found a seat in the very last row, behind a column partially blocked from view. She watched as Jason's family swept in with polished smiles. His mother wore a navy blue gown and pearls and was ushered to the front with murmurs of, "Mrs. Whitmore, this way." Someone handed her a corsage. Margaret had no corsage. She sat quietly, hands clasped, trying to catch Claire's eye as the music began. But Claire never looked her way. All her attention was on Jason, who stood tall, beaming, and on the rows of guests who leaned forward to capture photos of the glowing couple. Margaret's heart pounded as she took it all in. The orchestral swell, the petals strewn on the aisle, the whispered excitement from strangers who'd never heard her name. Claire walked past her, radiant in the gown Margaret had made, but didn't even glance in her direction. The officiant welcomed the guests, calling out special thanks to the Whitmore family, who've so generously hosted today's celebration. A round of applause followed. Margaret's hands didn't move. Her eyes didn't blink. When Claire and Jason exchanged vows, Margaret mouthed along softly, remembering how she once sang lullabies to that same voice, how she braided her hair before spelling bees, how she rubbed Vicks on her chest during flu season. Now she sat invisible at the back of the room, watching her daughter begin a new life that had no space for her. Then came the family toasts. Jason's father stood, thanking everyone for coming, lauding his son's achievements, and welcoming Claire as the daughter we've always dreamed of. Claire's mother-in-law followed, tearing up as she said, "From the moment I met Claire, I knew she was mine." Margaret waited. Maybe Claire would say something. Maybe she'd mention the dress, or her mother, or even just offer a glance toward the back row. But when Claire rose to speak, she looked only at Jason's family. "Thank you to the Whitmores for loving me like your own. I'm proud to carry your name now." The room erupted in cheers. Margaret clapped once, softly, then lowered her hands. Her face was a frozen mask, her lungs tight. No one noticed her leave her seat. No one turned to watch her step outside into the late afternoon light. She stood near the parking lot, hands trembling, listening to laughter echo through the open doors. Claire's voice floated above it all, cheerful, effortless. Margaret pressed her fingers to her temples, as if to hold herself together. Inside, the music swelled. Outside, Margaret walked away. Margaret stood by the tall glass doors of the reception hall, watching through the pane as guests gathered inside, the chandelier light glittering like champagne bubbles. Her hands were still, clasped in front of her, the only movement being the subtle twitch of her jaw. Inside, Claire stood on a low stage, microphone in hand, her cheeks flushed from wine and attention. Jason stood beside her, arm wrapped around her waist, the golden couple framed perfectly by ivory drapes and flower arches. The room grew quiet as Claire tapped the microphone. "I just want to take a moment to say thank you," she began, her voice clear and confident, "to Jason, my best friend, to the Whitmores, who welcomed me into their family from the very first moment." Margaret leaned slightly forward. Maybe this was it. Claire's voice caught slightly, as if emotion were swelling. "To my new mom," she said, turning toward Jason's mother. "You've shown me what unconditional love looks like. You've been my guide, my example, my strength. I love you, Mom." Gasps, applause, a few tears. Jason's mother stood, embracing Claire tightly. Margaret's ears rang. The word Mom echoed like a slap. Claire turned to the crowd again, smiling. "And to Miss Margaret, thank you for helping with the arrangements today. The flowers were beautiful." Laughter bubbled from the guests, casual, oblivious. Some clapped, others murmured, "That must be her." But no one turned. Miss Margaret, not Mom, not even my mother. Margaret blinked slowly. The sting in her chest wasn't sharp. It was dull, like an old bruise pressed too hard. A silence built inside her, not of shock, but of clarity. Something had ended, not in violence, not in screams, just dissolved. As she turned to leave, she passed Jason near the dessert table. He held a flute of champagne and glanced at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "Oh, wow," he said, almost chuckling. "Didn't expect to see you here. Honestly, I didn't even know you were still around. Claire said you sort of disappeared." Margaret gave a tight smile. "No," she said quietly. "Not yet." He laughed again, as if she'd told a joke. She kept walking. Outside, dusk had fallen. The sky was bruised purple, and the first stars blinked to life above the trees. Margaret walked toward the parking lot slowly, the cold air biting through the thin fabric of her dress. Halfway there, she paused, reached into her purse, and pulled out the garment bag containing the backup piece of the wedding dress, the silk overskirt she'd crafted just in case. Earlier that day, someone had spilled wine near the cake table. The skirt had caught the splash. A red stain bloomed across the delicate fabric like a wound. Margaret held it up now, the silk limp in her hands, the embroidery catching the last slant of sunlight. It looked broken, wrong, disrespected, just like everything she had offered. She walked over to the nearest trash bin, metal, dented, half full with plastic cutlery and napkins, and pushed the skirt in, gently but firmly. Her hands lingered for a moment on the edge. Then she let go. Back home, the apartment felt hollow. Claire's childhood room was untouched. Framed drawings, a stuffed rabbit, old trophies. Margaret walked past it without looking. She changed out of her dress, made tea without boiling the water fully, and sat at her desk where stacks of unopened mail had begun to collect. She opened the drawer. Inside was a single sheet of stationery with a floral border, one of the last from the set Claire had given her in high school. Margaret smoothed the paper with steady hands and began to write. "Dear Claire, thank you for giving me clarity today. I now understand something I'd been too blind or too hopeful to see. I am no longer your mother. Perhaps I stopped being that a long time ago, and today was simply your way of telling me clearly. And I heard you, loud and quiet all at once. Take care of yourself. That's all I ever wanted anyway. Goodbye, Margaret." She didn't sign it, Mom. She didn't cry. She folded the letter and slid it into an envelope. No address. It would stay in the drawer beneath old receipts and expired coupons. Unsent, unread, but that didn't matter. Margaret took a deep breath and stood up. In the mirror above her writing desk, she caught her reflection. Her eyes weren't red. Her face wasn't contorted. She looked still, like a painting in a quiet museum. In the kitchen, the kettle finally whistled. She turned off the stove, poured the water into her mug, and sat down again, staring out the window at the growing night. Stars twinkled overhead, indifferent, eternal. Claire's laughter was now a memory, distant, blurry, and already starting to fade. The next morning, Margaret rose before dawn. There was no hesitation, no mourning period. She moved through the apartment like someone completing a checklist, not a farewell. Every motion was quiet and deliberate. She folded the spare linens, emptied the fridge, unplugged every lamp. Her reflection passed wordlessly in the hallway mirror. Even her footsteps were silent, as if she were already halfway gone. She packed only what fit in 2 suitcases. A few changes of clothes, her reading glasses, 3 paperbacks, a journal, and a photo of Claire at age 10, grinning with missing teeth and a chocolate-smeared chin. She almost left the photo behind, but at the last second, slipped it between the pages of her journal, like a pressed flower. Then she opened the lockbox and withdrew her life savings, a modest pension, carefully accumulated, barely touched. She counted it once, twice, and placed the bills in an envelope marked final. It was more than enough to disappear. She didn't call Claire. She didn't leave a voicemail. She left no trace, no farewell letters, no cryptic clues, just a set of house keys in an envelope dropped into her neighbor's mailbox, accompanied by a short note. "Keep the plants if you'd like. They don't require much." And then she deleted her email, closed her bank accounts, disabled her phone. By noon, Margaret no longer existed in the modern world, but she wasn't entirely alone. When she opened the front door to leave, a small ginger cat darted between her ankles and meowed, indignant. Penny. The cat had been a gift from Claire on Margaret's 50th birthday. A surprise, wrapped in a box with holes punched in the lid and a pink bow taped to the top. At the time, Claire had said, "So you won't be alone anymore." Margaret had laughed, teared up, and named the kitten Penny, short for Pendleton, the name of her favorite childhood librarian. In the years that followed, Penny had become a fixture in her quiet world, curling on her lap during winter storms, meowing at soap operas, purring when Margaret read aloud. Now, 13 years later, Penny was old, slower, but still sharp-eyed and loyal. Margaret bent down and scratched behind her ears. "I guess you're coming too," she whispered. They left together. Margaret didn't drive far, just 3 hours north, deep into the foothills of the Appalachian Range, nestled between pine trees and forgotten gravel roads. There, she'd found a listing for a modest cabin beside a lake. No neighbors, no mail delivery, no cell signal. The ad had read, "For those seeking quiet that feels like a blanket." She paid 3 months' rent in advance, in cash. The cabin smelled of cedar and dust. Its walls were raw wood, its windows cloudy, its floor slightly warped. But it had a working fireplace, shelves for books, and a small dock that reached into the still water like an outstretched arm. Margaret unpacked slowly. She lined the bookshelf with her paperbacks, filled the kettle, and placed Claire's childhood photo on the kitchen windowsill. Penny circled the living room once before curling up on a threadbare armchair like she'd always lived there. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath a pale sun, quiet as breath. The first few days passed in numbness. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply existed, waking, dressing, feeding Penny, and walking the perimeter of the lake. Each step felt unfamiliar, like she was learning how to walk in a new body. Her mind flickered with memory, but she swatted them away like mosquitoes. At night, she stared at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the cabin, the wind through the trees, the steady rhythm of Penny's purring beside her. The silence wasn't painful. It was heavy, but not cruel. It was honest. One afternoon, Margaret wandered deeper into the woods and discovered a hidden clearing full of wildflowers. Yellow, violet, blue. She sat on a fallen log and let the stillness wrap around her. For the first time in weeks, her chest loosened. She tilted her face to the sky and let herself breathe. Later that night, she opened her journal and wrote, "Day 5. No one knows where I am. I don't think anyone's looking. And strangely, that feels okay." She paused. Penny snored today. It was the loudest thing in the house. The words felt strange, like a language she'd forgotten, but they flowed. And when she finished the page, she read it back. Not aloud, just with her eyes, and smiled. Something inside her was beginning to thaw. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it wasn't grief either. It was the beginning of something unnamed, a pause between notes. A breath before the music returns. The journal entries began as quiet companions, short thoughts, observations, fragments of grief. Margaret never wrote them for anyone but herself, yet each page brought a subtle relief, like draining a wound slowly, deliberately. By the end of her 3rd week in the cabin, the pages began to expand. She didn't just document her days, she explored them. She described the way sunlight shifted through pine trees, how Penny's fur felt warmer when it was about to rain, how strange it was to live in a world where no one expected anything from her. Not a smile, not a casserole, not even presents. She gave herself a pen name, Eliza S., a nod to her childhood nickname and her favorite poet, Emily Dickinson. The anonymity was comforting, freeing. As Eliza, she wasn't anyone's mother, anyone's failure, anyone's burden. She was just a voice, telling the truth. Eventually, on a whim, she created a simple blog. The internet connection was weak, accessible only when the wind tilted the satellite just right. But it worked. The blog was bare bones, black text on a white background, no photos, no bio, just words. She titled it, Letters from the Lake. At first, no one read it, but she didn't care. Writing became ritual. Morning tea, then a post, sometimes philosophical reflections, Sometimes a single paragraph about how the fog over the water reminded her of forgiveness. Sometimes aching admissions she couldn't say aloud. After a month, strangers began to find her. A woman from Oregon commented, "You put into words what I've carried for years." A man in Wales wrote, "My mother left quietly too. I never understood her silence until now." Margaret never replied. She let the words stand on their own, like paper boats released into the current. Then, one night, she received a notification for a new comment that made her stomach lurch. It read, "This character reminds me of every emotionally manipulative mother who plays victim and calls it love. Weak, self-absorbed, and unable to move on. Maybe she deserves to be forgotten." The username was simple, ClaireMD92. Margaret stared at the screen for a long time. Her hand hovered above the trackpad, unmoving. Claire, it had to be. Same name, same birth year, same tone. Cold, clinical, final. She read the comment again, slower this time. The words didn't stab, they pressed. Not like a blade, but a weight. Something she knew too well. Something she used to carry every time Claire dismissed a meal, rolled her eyes, or forgot a birthday. At first, she felt nothing. Then, something broke. But it wasn't rage. It wasn't sorrow. It was relief. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time in weeks, no months, tears welled in her eyes. Not out of hurt, but release. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't oversensitive or too fragile. She had been forgotten, devalued, erased, and now acknowledged in the most brutal way. And yet, she was still here, still whole, still writing. Margaret closed the laptop, exhaled long and deep, and went outside. The stars were clear that night, the kind of sky you only see when you're far from anything that forgets your name. She sat on the dock with her legs crossed, Penny curled beside her, purring like a living metronome. She whispered, "Thank you, Claire." Not with sarcasm, not with pain, just gratitude. That night, she didn't write a blog post. She planted bulbs instead, lilies, tulips, daffodils, beneath the kitchen window. The soil was cold, hard, but she pressed through. She didn't need beauty now. She needed promise. Growth she wouldn't see until the thaw, something living to come from everything buried. The next day, she found an injured raccoon near the woodshed. Its leg was twisted, eyes wide with pain. Margaret didn't panic. She wrapped it in an old towel, whispered soothing nonsense, and fashioned a splint from popsicle sticks and gauze. She named him Rusty. Over the following weeks, more animals came, a fawn with a limp, a squirrel with a torn ear, a nest of orphaned robins. Margaret tended to each of them gently, like pages from a fragile book. She researched, read, improvised. Her cabin transformed. What had once been a sanctuary of silence became a refuge for the overlooked, the forgotten, the barely breathing. And somehow, intending to them, she mended herself. She began to write less about the past and more about the present. Her posts shifted, from mourning to marveling. The sound of frogs at dusk, the way Rusty began to trust her, the quiet satisfaction of planting something without knowing if it would bloom. The blog flourished. Readers came in droves, not because they knew her story, but because they recognized something in her honesty, an ache, a grace, a gentle rebellion. Letters from the lake became a whisper carried across the internet, finding people who'd never been seen. Margaret never told them who she was. She didn't need to. She was no longer Miss Margaret or Mom or a name in a seating chart. She was Eliza, a gardener of wounds, a keeper of creatures, a woman reborn petal by petal. The forest had always been a place of quiet for Margaret, but it was during a late autumn walk that silence became something else entirely, an invitation. She was following a narrow deer path near the ridge above the lake when she heard laughter, not loud or careless, but light, like wind catching dry leaves. She paused, listening. Voices followed, female, overlapping, some young, others cracked with age. Curiosity pulled her forward. Just beyond a grove of birch trees, she discovered a small clearing encircled by logs and folding chairs. At the center was a fire pit. low flames licking at pieces of brush. A kettle perched on a metal grate, steaming gently. Around the fire sat 5 women. One stirred the kettle. Another strummed a guitar. They were bundled in flannel and scarves, their cheeks pink with cold and something else. Belonging. Margaret lingered at the edge, unsure. A woman with silver braids looked up and smiled. "First time?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Then sit." We saved a chair. It was that simple. No questions, no introductions, no performance of grief. She sat, listened, sipped tea when offered, and absorbed the rhythm of their gathering. They called themselves the Hollow Circle, not because they were empty, but because they'd all been made hollow at some point and had chosen to fill the space together. They met weekly, informally, always outdoors. No therapy, no agendas, just stories. Over the weeks that followed, Margaret became a regular. She never said much. They didn't press her. Each woman had come from something painful. Abandonment, betrayal, lies. One had left a husband who erased her. Another had buried a child. A third had been cast out by siblings over an inheritance dispute. The common thread was this: they had all been erased by someone they loved. One evening, beneath a sky bruised with twilight, Margaret finally spoke. "I used to be someone's mother," she said, her voice brittle but steady. "Now I'm someone's ghost." No one gasped. No one reached to comfort her. They simply nodded as if acknowledging a universal truth. "You still breathe," the woman with silver braids replied. "That makes you a witness, not a ghost." Margaret exhaled. Something inside her unclenched. From then on, she shared more. Never names, never places, just the contours of her wound, the way it felt to be called Miss Margaret, the silence in her daughter's eyes, the heaviness of a wedding dress crumpled in a trash can. She called herself Eliza still. No one questioned it. One particularly foggy morning, Margaret stood by the lake and thought about how stories dissolve when they're not told. Pain becomes myth, details blur, and the worst of it, loneliness, grows sharp in the absence of witness. That's when she knew what she wanted to build. Not just a blog, not just survival, a space, a place where people could place their grief down, even for a moment. She had a small sum left from her pension, enough for something modest. With the help of one of the Hollow Circle women, a retired carpenter named Lena, she found an old storage barn on the edge of town. It was sagging and drafty, with a cracked window and a warped door. But it had potential, and more importantly, it had roots. Over the next 6 weeks, Margaret worked every day. She swept cobwebs, painted shelves, repaired floorboards. She collected books from donation centers, memoirs, poetry, classics, even self-help titles with dog-eared pages. She strung lights along the beams and placed mismatched teacups on a salvaged hutch. In one corner, she built a writing nook, a desk with a typewriter, a jar of pens, and a stack of blank cards. Above it, she nailed a wooden sign, "Leave your story, let it rest." She named the place the Quiet Shelf. Half library, half tea room, it had no cash register. People gave what they could. Tea was always steeping, soft music always playing, and Penny always curled on the front chair like a dozing greeter. Visitors trickled in slowly. A teenager running from a fight with her parents, a widower who hadn't spoken his wife's name aloud in years, a woman whose children had blocked her number. They came. They drank, they read, they wrote. The cards piled up. Some hung on strings clipped like laundry. Others were tucked into books. Some left anonymously beneath teacups, weighted down with sugar packets. I thought I was the only one. He never said sorry, but I stopped needing it. She doesn't call me Mom anymore, but I still call her mine. Margaret read every one. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The space began to hum with something bigger than healing. It became proof that silence didn't mean absence, that a quiet room filled with pain and tea and shared breath could carry the weight of things unspoken. And Margaret, once erased, became the curator of everyone's echoes. Not loudly, not for recognition, just so no one would have to disappear again without being remembered. It happened subtly, so subtly that Margaret didn't notice at first. One morning, a card appeared on the Quiet Shelf's writing desk. It wasn't signed, Just a plain, cream-colored card with tidy handwriting. Eliza, I know your real name, and I won't tell. You saved me with your silence. Let me return the favor. Margaret read it twice, 3 times. Her hands trembled, but not with fear. There was no threat in the message, only reverence and relief. She looked around the room, half expecting someone to reveal themselves, but the tea room was calm, filled with the soft rustle of pages and the gentle clink of porcelain. She folded the card and placed it in a drawer beneath the counter. That evening, she burned it in the fireplace, watching the paper curl into ash. She didn't need to know who it was. Trust doesn't always require names. Word of the quiet shelf spread. Slowly at first, local whispers shared links to the blog, an occasional feature in a community paper. But then a lifestyle journalist visited while on vacation, left her own story pinned to a teacup, and wrote a glowing piece titled, "The Cabin Where Grief Goes to Heal." After that, people came in steady streams, not tourists, not voyeurs, but wanderers, survivors, those still raw, those quietly breaking. They began calling Margaret the Healing Lady, a name that made her laugh when she first heard it, brushing flour from her apron. She never corrected them. Some titles are better earned than claimed. One day, a child came in with her father. The girl couldn't have been more than 7, with frizzy curls and oversized glasses. She wandered to the back, opened a book, and whispered, "It smells like safety here." Margaret turned away quickly, pretending to stir the tea. The journal entries on her blog shifted. More poetry, more observations, fewer wounds, more blooming. Across the country, in a hospital in Baltimore, Claire woke from a dream she couldn't explain. In it, her mother stood at the edge of a frozen lake, wearing a green dress. She didn't speak. She simply smiled, then turned and walked into the trees. Claire sat up, heart pounding. She hadn't thought about her mother in weeks, months maybe. The wedding had come and gone. Her career had exploded in noise and responsibility. But lately, things felt off, like she was forgetting something critical. A presence, a tether. She began having dreams regularly, scenes from childhood dancing in the kitchen, Margaret reading by lamplight the way her mother used to tuck handwritten notes into her lunchbox. But when she awoke, the feeling vanished, like steam from a mirror. Jason noticed her restlessness, or maybe he ignored it. Until the morning, his world imploded. Claire had just returned from a night shift when she saw flashing lights outside their condo. FBI, IRS, state officers. Jason was in handcuffs. Fraud, embezzlement, false investment accounts tied to shell corporations, whispers of insider trading. Claire stood in the doorway as her life fell apart. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted. Jason didn't meet her eyes. By noon, his face was on every screen. By nightfall, the hospital had placed her on administrative leave, pending evaluation. The silence that followed was unbearable. She fled the condo and booked a last-minute train ticket west. No destination in mind, just movement. Forward, away, anywhere but the life she no longer understood. It was in a small thrift bookstore in the Appalachian foothills that she found it. A journal, worn leather, floral border, tucked between a stack of forgotten self-help guides. Something about it pulled at her. When she opened the first page, her hands froze. Day 5. No one knows where I am. I don't think anyone's looking. And strangely, that feels okay. The handwriting, the phrasing, her breath caught. A whisper in her mind said, "This is her." She turned page after page. Stories of silence, animals, tea, a raccoon named Rusty, a writing desk where people left pain behind. The language was unmistakable, quiet but powerful. Margaret, her mother. She clutched the journal to her chest and sat on the floor between shelves, shaking. Claire didn't cry, not yet. She just sat there, breathing in pages filled with a mother she thought she'd lost, only to realize, perhaps, she had never really known her at all, and that somewhere, out in the trees and tea and quiet spaces, Margaret had chosen not to die, but to live. Without her, without needing her, without resentment. Claire didn't know whether to feel guilt or awe, so she let herself feel both. Claire arrived in the small mountain town just before noon. The train ride had been long and quiet, giving her too much time to rehearse questions she didn't know how to ask. She hadn't slept. The leather journal was in her bag, pressed against her chest like a borrowed heartbeat. Every time she touched it, her fingers trembled. The directions she'd found online were vague. Across from the red barn, past the creek. No sign, no advertisement. Just whispers on local forums and the faded address scribbled on a receipt tucked in the journal. She walked with slow steps through the sleepy main street. Her coat hung loosely on her shoulders, hair unbrushed, eyes rimmed in exhaustion. No one noticed her. No one asked why a woman in hospital scrubs and sneakers was wandering aimlessly with a duffel bag. Then she saw it. The quiet shelf. It looked nothing like a bookstore, more like a cottage someone forgot to finish painting. The front porch sagged slightly. A pot of yellow tulips sat beside the door, blooming defiantly despite the cold. Claire froze. Through the wide front window, she saw her. Margaret, her mother, sitting at a small wooden table, wiping a teacup with a dish towel, hair longer than she remembered, wearing a faded sweater and soft expression. She looked older, softer, but unmistakably alive. Claire's breath caught. Her first instinct was to rush in, to throw her arms around the woman she'd spent the last 6 months trying not to think about, but her legs didn't move. She couldn't do it. Instead, she circled around the back and slipped in through the side entrance, as quietly as a shadow. Inside, the room smelled of cinnamon and cedar. Books lined every wall. Handmade cards fluttered on strings. The clink of spoons and murmured voices filled the air. She found a seat in the farthest corner, half hidden behind a tall plant. From there, she could see everything without being seen. And so, she watched. Margaret moved with slow, purposeful grace. She poured tea, smiled at each guest, bent to pick up a dropped crayon. She didn't look like someone escaping. She looked like someone who had finally arrived. Claire's eyes blurred. How could this be the same woman she'd once dismissed as outdated, irrelevant? How had she failed to notice this strength, this gentle command of space? She blinked back tears, breathing through her nose. Then came the moment that broke her. A small boy, maybe 5, ran up to the front counter. His cheeks were red, his shoelaces untied. He held a paper in one hand and a cookie in the other. "Grandma Margaret," he chirped, "can I put my story in the magic box?" Claire froze. Margaret bent down, brushing a curl from the boy's forehead. "Of course, sweetheart, let's do it together." They walked over to a small wooden chest with a painted sign, "Stories that need somewhere to sleep." The boy slid his paper inside with both hands. Margaret clapped softly, then kissed the top of his head. Claire gripped the edge of her chair. Grandma Margaret! Someone else had claimed the word she had abandoned. And somehow, it felt right. She wanted to be angry, to shout, to demand an explanation for the wedding, the silence, the months of emptiness. But what would she say? Why didn't you fight harder for me? Why did you let me forget you? Why didn't you tell me you were more than just my mother? All questions that would only echo. So instead, she cried, quietly. Tears slid down her cheeks without noise, absorbed by the wool of her scarf. She watched her mother and wept not because she was angry, but because she was ashamed. Ashamed of how much she had missed. Ashamed of how small she had made the woman who had made her everything. Margaret never looked her way, not yet. Claire stayed until the last guest left, heart pounding. But when her mother turned out the lights and disappeared into the back room, Claire slipped out the door unseen. She stood on the porch, unsure what came next. But one thing was certain, she would come back tomorrow. The next morning, Claire returned before the door was even unlocked. She waited on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, heart thudding in her ears like a war drum. The tulips beside her seemed brighter in the morning light, as if the earth was mocking her hesitation by blooming without apology. Inside, Margaret moved behind the counter, unaware. She carried a kettle in one hand and a bundle of napkins in the other. Penny the cat yawned from her corner chair, stretching with the entitlement of old age and trust. Claire took a breath, stepped forward, and knocked softly. Margaret looked up. Their eyes met through the glass. Seconds passed, long enough for Claire to forget how to breathe. Her pulse screamed, her mouth dried. Margaret didn't blink. She didn't narrow her eyes. She didn't cry. She simply walked to the door, opened it gently, and said, "Come in, Claire." It wasn't a question. Claire stepped inside. The room smelled the same, cinnamon and cedar, but now it wrapped around her differently. Not like a visitor, like someone returning to a memory she had buried too deeply. They stood facing each other, both unsure of where to place their hands. The silence pulsed between them like static, not hostile, just full. Claire started, voice cracking. Margaret raised a hand, not to stop her, but to soften her. "Sit," she said, motioning to a small round table near the window. "You look cold." Claire obeyed, her legs suddenly unsure of their strength. Margaret poured tea without ceremony, sliding a cup across the table. No trembling, no visible emotion, just grace. Claire reached for the mug, but her hand hovered midair. "You read my comment," she whispered. "On the blog." Margaret stirred her tea once, twice. "I read all of them." A pause. "I didn't know it was you." "I figured." More silence. Claire blinked. "You didn't say anything." Margaret finally met her gaze. "I didn't need to. You already had." Claire winced. "I didn't mean those words. I was angry, not at you, at everything." Margaret took a sip of tea. "That's allowed." Tears welled up again, uninvited. "I said such awful things." Margaret set down her cup. She reached into the drawer beside her, pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, and laid it gently on the table between them. "I wrote this after I left, Batanna," she said. "Every day, every wound, every joy I still allowed myself. I didn't expect you to ever read it, but I think it belongs to you now." Claire looked down. The notebook wasn't flashy, worn corners, a ribbon bookmark, a crack in the spine, but it pulsed with something sacred. She didn't open it. Not yet. "I came here thinking I needed your forgiveness," Claire said, barely above a whisper. "But maybe what I really needed was to understand you." Margaret leaned back in her chair, folded her hands in her lap. Her expression didn't soften or harden. It simply settled. "You don't need my forgiveness," she said. Claire's eyes filled. "I do." "No," Margaret replied. "You're not that little girl who spilled juice on her homework or came home after curfew. You're a grown woman. You've made choices. Some good, some painful. You don't need to be forgiven, Claire. You just need to live with what you've learned." Claire's lips trembled. "And you? Can you live with it?" Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached across the table and gently placed her fingers over Claire's. "Of course I can," she said. "I already have." And that was it. No long speech, no dramatic reconciliation, no unraveling of years with one conversation. Just two women, once mother and daughter, now something else, sitting in shared silence, hands loosely entwined. Outside the window, a breeze stirred the tulips. Penny yawned again and hopped onto Margaret's lap. Claire opened the notebook. Not to read, just to feel its weight. She didn't need the words today. What she needed was the woman in front of her. Still here, still breathing, still hers. Even if not in the way she used to be. They sat together for a long time, saying nothing, and in that silence something returned. Not the past, not what was lost, but what remained. The storm rolled in just after midnight, sheets of rain lashing against the cabin roof, wind howling like an old sorrow returned. Inside, Margaret sat at her writing desk with a blanket over her lap and Penny curled against her ankles. A candle flickered beside her as she filled the final page of her journal. "This will be my last entry," she wrote. "Not because I've run out of words, but because the silence has finally given me everything I need." She closed the book gently, her hands calm, her breathing steady. Outside, thunder grumbled low like a voice speaking from the roots of the earth. In the morning, Claire arrived early, as she'd started doing most days. She brought fresh bread, restocked the tea tins, and helped organize the donation box. But that morning, something was wrong. The lights were still off, no tea kettle whistling, no cat meowing. Claire opened the door slowly. The room was still. She found Margaret in her chair, a shawl draped over her shoulders, Penny resting quietly on her chest. The journal lay closed on the table beside her, a pen tucked neatly into the spine. Claire dropped to her knees, shaking, reaching, but it was already done. Margaret was gone. No pain, no panic, just peace. The funeral was private. Claire didn't send announcements, didn't post anything online. She chose a spot by the lake, under the birch trees where her mother used to walk at dusk. A local carpenter built a simple wooden box. No flowers, no hymns, just the sound of wind through the branches and the soft purring of Penny curled nearby. Claire stood alone, clutching the final journal in her arms. "This isn't goodbye," she whispered. "This is thank you." After the burial, Claire returned to the cabin and began the slow process of cleaning, sorting, sifting through a life reduced to objects. Each drawer held echoes, each bookshelf whispered. When she opened the bottom drawer of the writing desk, she found an envelope with her name on it. "Claire, if you're reading this, then you already know. I didn't disappear to hurt you. I disappeared so I could remember myself before it was too late. You're strong. You've always been. But strength without softness becomes armor, and armor keeps everything out, even love. So here's my last gift. Everything I've built here, I've given away. Not out of spite, but because I've already given you the only thing that mattered, the truth of who I am. Don't chase ghosts. Build something alive. Mom." Claire stared at the letter for a long time. Then she found the paperwork. Margaret had donated the entire contents of the quiet shelf, the books, the furniture, even the cabin lease, to a women's center in the next town, a nonprofit that helped women who had been abandoned, forgotten, or erased. She left Claire nothing, not a dollar, not a book, not even the cat. Penny's adoption papers had already been signed over to the tea room's new caretaker, a woman from the hollow circle. At first, Claire felt hollow, but then she laughed. Not bitterly, not cruelly, just softly, because it was exactly what Margaret would have done. She hadn't left Claire with possessions. She had left her with perspective, with stories, with silence, yes, but not the kind that hurts, the kind that teaches, the kind that heals. Claire didn't return to Baltimore. She didn't go back to the hospital. She didn't answer calls from old colleagues. She didn't step foot in the condo she once shared with Jason, now empty and stained with headlines. Instead, she stayed in the town where her mother had come to disappear and ended up creating something eternal. Weeks passed, then months. Claire slowly pieced together Margaret's legacy, the receipts, the blog archives, the notes Margaret had never intended for anyone to read, but that spoke volumes nonetheless. She read every journal, every post. She sat with members of the Hollow Circle, listened to stories about Eliza, about the quiet strength of a woman who never preached, but always welcomed. And then one day, Claire knew what she needed to do. Margaret's Whisper. That was the name that came to her. Simple, soft, and true. She launched the foundation quietly. No press release, no influencer campaign, just a single-page website with a quote from one of Margaret's blog entries. "Sometimes silence is the loudest kind of love." The fund's mission was clear: to support women who had been silenced by families, by systems, by grief. It offered writing workshops, micro-grants for relocation, emotional wellness retreats, and most importantly, safe spaces to be heard without having to perform their pain. At the heart of the foundation was the quiet shelf, now expanded and preserved exactly as Margaret had left it. Claire kept the tea steeping, the cards on the strings, the mismatched chairs, the same uneven floorboards that creaked at just the right spot. People came from across the country, not to take photos, but to exhale, to heal. The blog was republished under Claire's care. She didn't change a word. She added no commentary. The world read Margaret's words exactly as she'd written them. Raw, poetic, sometimes heartbreaking, always honest. Claire never tried to replace her mother's voice. She simply amplified it. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after Margaret's death, Claire sat on a bench near the tulip garden behind the library. The wind carried the scent of soil and soft petals. Children played in the grass. Volunteers passed out lemonade and seed packets. It was the anniversary of Margaret's whisper, and the community had gathered without being told. They just knew. Claire wore a white blouse and Margaret's favorite green shawl. She held a stack of freshly printed journals, gifts for anyone who wanted to write their first story. A little girl approached her, freckled nose, shy eyes, maybe 10 years old. She pointed to the bronze plaque mounted on the wall, in honor of Margaret, the woman who let silence speak. "Who was she?" the girl asked. Claire looked down, a smile tugging at her lips. "She was the only person I've ever met," she said softly, "who didn't need to be remembered to live forever." The girl blinked. "That's weird." Claire laughed. "Maybe. But sometimes the weirdest people are the ones who save us without ever saying a word." The wind picked up, gentle and persistent. It swept through the tulip beds, tugged at the string of thank you cards hanging from the garden fence. Dozens of them, written by strangers, survivors, daughters, mothers. "Thank you for teaching me how to leave. Thank you for showing me I'm still whole. Thank you for proving I'm not alone." As the breeze lifted them, the cards fluttered like birds, their corners dancing in sunlight. A few broke free from the strings, rising into the sky, caught in flight. Claire watched them go, not with grief, but with wonder. And somewhere in the quiet space between branches, in the hush of the garden's breath, Margaret smiled, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a presence, still whispering.